Order, please. I'd like to welcome everybody to the House of Assembly Management Commission meeting for today, May the 4th. Just before we get going, I just want to take care of a couple of housekeeping items here if I can. Just want to remind all members and staff to keep your mics muted until you're called upon by the chair to speak. Just wait for a second or so after the chair has recognized you to allow for the technical unmuting to occur. And if you wish to speak at any time, just raise your hand so I can see it on the screen here. We have a relatively small group, so I'll keep track that way. And I'm going to ask, by way of roll call here, all committee members to introduce themselves and to state the name of the constituency that you represent. So we'll begin with Minister McClellan.
Jeff McClellan, MLA for Glace Bay.
Minister Porter.
Chuck Porter, MLA for Hants West.
Deputy Speaker Bain.
Keith Bain, MLA, Victoria de Lakes.
Ms. DiCostanzo.
Rafa DiCostanzo, MLA for Clayton Park West. Good afternoon.
Mr. McMaster.
Alan McMaster, MLA for Inverness.
Ms. McFarlane.
Carla McFarlane, MLA for Pictou West.
Ms. Chender.
Claudia Chender, MLA for Dartmouth South.
And for staff joining us today, we have Chief Clerk Charlton, Deb Lusby from the Speaker's Administration Office, and Chief Legislative Counsel Gordon Hebb. So welcome, everybody. We also have some caucus staff members on the line, but not participating directly in the meeting. So I'd like to welcome them as well. And just draw everybody's attention to the email Deborah has provided, the agenda and all the supporting materials in advance, and there has been a couple of late breaking emails there, so we may beg some extra patience today just to make sure that everybody's looking at the right documents as we go, and if we need to pause for a minute or two just to allow people to sort that out, just speak up and we'll be happy to do so. So I just want to begin with a motion. Everybody received the agenda, and I understand there's going to be a request to add an item to the agenda. So with that, Ms. Chender.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to ask that a motion be considered at the end of our meeting today.
Okay. Is it agreed? We'll entertain that motion.
Agreed.
It is agreed. Okay, we'll deal with that after we're done with the agenda as circulated previously. So the next item, or the first item, is the approval of the minutes from the previous meeting. Those have been circulated in advance. Everybody's had a chance to review, so I'll entertain a motion to accept those minutes as presented, or if anybody has any changes or corrections. Minister McClellan, move. Seconder. Ms. DiCostanzo, all in favor, please signify aye.
Aye.
I guess technically
Aye.
Raise your hand is what I'm looking for. Contrary minded? Thank you. Motion carried. So we'll now move on to the first item on our agenda, which is the proposed amendments to the following House of Assembly Management Commission regulations, and there's been a number of attachments circulated to go with that. And I'm going to turn that over to Chief Clerk Charlton to walk us through those proposed amendments.
Thank you kindly, Chair. So there's a number of House of Assembly Management Commission amendments that are being put forward. They're in three batches, if you will. I will speak to the first batch and the third batch. So the first batch of amendments is amendments to sections 18, 19, 19A, and 19B of the House of Assembly Management Commission regulations. as well as a revised form of lease. So this attachment was sent out with the original agenda. So you've had this for a while now. And in a nutshell, the changes included in this are as follows. First of all, the House of Assembly Management Commission would no longer be required to involve the former Department of Transportation and Infrastructure Renewal to assess and advise on leases or be responsible for property maintenance, but it would be an option if agreed by the Speaker or Commission and the department. So this is sort of twofold. One is reflecting the fact that the department's name has changed, but more importantly, making it non-mandatory, their involvement in these activities. It's purely optional. This would also allow the Speaker or Commission the option to retain expertise from elsewhere, a third-party private sector if need be. The next aspect of these amendments is providing that a waiver of compliance with merely technical non-compliance with the barrier-free regulations or requirements would become a decision for the Speaker to make rather than the Commission, although the Speaker would retain the option to refer that matter to the Commission for a decision. This simply means these matters could be decided by the Speaker rather than always having to come forward to the Commission. And thirdly, a waiver of compliance with merely technical non-compliance with the barrier-free requirements would no longer require consultation with the former Department of Transportation and Infrastructure Renewal. But again, it would remain an option if agreed to by the Speaker or Commission and the department. This would again allow the option of seeking expertise elsewhere, such as the private sector or from some other source. Lastly, the revised form of lease that I alluded to earlier, that also goes along with this package of amendments, simply swaps out the MLA themselves as the tenant of the lease rather than the Queen as represented by the Speaker of the House. So I'd be happy to entertain any questions if you have them. Otherwise, I'll turn it back to the chair.
Okay, Minister Porter.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and Mr. Charlton as well. Just quickly on that last part around the MLA versus the other. I'm just thinking about future leases, I guess, given my current circumstances, but we do have some issues around or some policy guiding a new member. So when I leave a new member or the office has been set up, the accessibility, et cetera, is all there. They would take that office over. Why would it not remain the Crown versus the MLA's name in that lease? I'm not 100% sure why we would do that.
Well, we've conducted a jurisdictional scan, and in most other jurisdictions, Deb may correct me if I'm off, it may be all other jurisdictions, it's the MLAs who are the tenants themselves rather than the Speaker's office or the Crown somehow. So we're just adapting this to follow along with the best practices in other jurisdictions. Really, we take a somewhat hands-off approach. The MLAs do get to select their own office, although where there's already an office, they may end up taking over that office because it already meets all the barrier-free requirements. But it's ultimately a choice for the MLAs. So therefore, it makes sense to have the lease be in the MLA's name rather than the Crown.
Very good. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Any other questions? Ms. DiCostanzo?
Does that make any difference for the payments that the Speaker's office paid directly to the landlord? Is that?
No, it doesn't. Those will remain reimbursed by the Speaker's office. So they'll still come out of the MLA's budget and are paid for out of those monies.
Okay. Any other questions or comments before we ask for the motion? So I'd like to have a motion to approve the amendments to sections 18, 19, 19A, and 19B of the House of Assembly Management Commission regulations and the revised form of lease, and for somebody to second the motion. So could I have a motion from Minister Porter, seconded by Ms. DiCostanzo? Would all those in favor of the motion please signify by raising your hand? Those opposed? Motion is carried. Thank you. Now, the second item, I'll ask Chief Legislative Counsel Gordon Hebb to walk us through the proposed changes to regulations 43A 1 and 2. Chief Counsel Hebb.
Mr. Chair, they're under section 43A. There are 5 different amounts that an MLA may be entitled to, which vary depending upon the size of the constituency. As a result of redistribution, there's 4 additional constituencies, but also quite a large number of the constituencies have a new name. So the regulations need to be updated to use the new names. Also, there has been some, as a result of the redistribution, some variation in the size of municipalities. And so what these regulations do is correlate the sizes of the 55 constituencies that we will have after the next election to the same sizes that they were divided before, and that's what you have before you. In addition to that, there is a provision presently that provides that where a member becomes a member during the year, that the amount is prorated based upon how long they've been a member. There's an additional provision proposed to deal with the fact that someone may be maybe not a new member, but maybe returning in a different size constituency, not necessarily the same constituency, or it could be partly the same constituency, but there may be a change in size. And so this new provision provides for prorating that as well. It could be going up, it could be going down, depending on the change in size of the constituency. That, I believe, sums it up, but I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Hebb. Are there any questions or comments? Okay, hearing none, I'll ask for a motion to approve the changes as proposed to section 43A of the House of Assembly Management Commission regulations.
So moved.
Moved by Minister McClellan, seconded by Mr. McMaster. Would all those in favor of the motion please signify by raising your hand? Those opposed? Motion is carried. Thank you very much. We'll move on to the next item, which was the a late addition that is proposed amendments to the House of Assembly Management Commission regulations, amendments to sections 19B and 43. And I'll ask the Chief Clerk to walk us through those.
Thank you very much, Chair. So there was a question yesterday that related to changing whose name is on the lease as tenant from the Crown to the MLA. And it sort of relates to the changes that were made to the House of Assembly Management regulations back in October, when we reduced the time for an outgoing MLA to wind up their office from 3 months to 1 month. And the question amounted to, is the MLA personally on the hook for the cost of that notice period? Because we still have a 3-month notice period on the leases, and that's really required so that landlords will be willing to sign a lease to have this reasonable notice period. But the question was, is the MLA responsible for this money personally, or is this part of the money that can be reimbursed? The intention all along has always been that that money would be reimbursed. However, the question did prompt a discussion about how well the regulations aligned with that intention. And so following discussions between myself and Deborah and myself and Gordon, we thought some amendments, some housekeeping amendments were in order to clarify that those amounts would be fully reimbursed to MLAs. So hence we have these amendments to Section 19B and Section 43. Section 43 is adding a new provision, or the amendment to Section 43 adds a new provision that makes it clear that the constituency office rent is reimbursable. And that's on the basis that if the office is not utilized by another member, so in most cases, the office will be utilized by another member, but in some cases, an outgoing member may find that their office will not be used by the next member for one reason or the other. And so if it's not utilized and if the notice to terminate the lease is given, then the lease will continue to be reimbursable for that notice period. In my discussions with Gordon, he also suggested a fix to Section 19B, sub 3, which is requiring that provision allows a lease to not comply with the requirement for a 3-month notice provision. And that would sometimes be necessary in order to secure barrier-free accommodations. Landlord may be making more substantial renovations and therefore want a longer notice period than 3 months. So in that case, we're also adding in a requirement that the speaker approve that notice period. So largely housekeeping amendments. They really don't change any of what was intended by the amendments that occurred last October, but just trying to make sure we clean everything up and make sure that the regulations fully match the intentions. That's all.
Okay. Thank you very much, Mr. Charlton. Any questions or comments? Minister Porter.
Thank you. Just around the, I have no issue with anything that you said, but just for clarity and again, housekeeping, as Deborah, you would know, my rent is just paid. It comes off. I don't pay it. The Speaker's office pays it as part of other things that they pay automatically as well. Is it somewhere in there clarified that that actually happens, or is that just assumed to happen as per normal? And the only reason I'm raising it is because it's specific to the rent, and the housekeeping is specific to the rent or the lease, call it what you will.
Okay. Ms. Lesby.
I believe in the regulations, it actually says that the Speaker's office is to pay the rent directly on behalf of the member. So we used the term, and James did the term reimbursement, but basically we are making those payments directly for all members. And we'll continue to do so for the 3 months of the lease that's required.
Great. Thanks very much.
Okay. Thank you. Any other questions or comments? Hearing none, no other questions or comments on that proposed amendment. I'll accept a motion for the amendments as presented to sections 19B and 43. Moved by Minister Porter, seconded by Minister McClellan. Would all those in favor of the motion please signify by raising your hand? And those opposed? Motion carried. Thank you. So now we'll move on to the additional motion that is been requested or has been requested by Ms. Chender. So I'll turn it over to Ms. Chender.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Before I introduce the motion, I'll just say that I recognize that we just unanimously passed some legislative changes that alter the constituency amounts for the incoming MLAs in various ways. And I recognize the necessity of doing that as we look forward to an election sometime soon. But what I'm suggesting here is that we look at office expenses generally. And I have been beating this drum for quite some time. My colleagues will know. And so I'm introducing a motion, and I'll just read it, and the clerk will then, I think, circulate it, or Mr. Charlton, if you wanted to circulate it now, that would be fine. All Nova Scotians should be able to expect similar services and support from their MLA offices. Each provincial district has unique features which may impact the costs of serving constituents, such as the number of constituents, different office rental markets, and geographic size. Some of these differences are taken into account in MLA budget allocations, such as geographic size, which results in additional travel and franking budgets for some constituencies, but others, such as office rental expenses and number of electors, are not taken into account. So the motion, I move that the House of Assembly Management Commission review MLA office budget allocations to ensure equitable access to resources required for MLAs to serve their constituents, and that the result and accompanying recommendation to improve expense equity be reported to the Commission at its next meeting. So that is the motion, and I would be happy for it to be discussed. I have circulated this motion to some of my colleagues in advance, and have been told that timeline may be too stringent, and so I am open to an amendment there. But I, again, have been asking for this to come to committee for the better part of 2 years. And so I'd like a timeline. The travel and franking is a separate amount, technically in the regulation, but unlike previously, it's just an amount that gets added if you have an extra large constituency, and we're not arguing against that in any way. But I'm saying that geographic size isn't the only thing that differentially impacts an MLA's ability to serve their constituents. So initially this came onto my radar because urban MLAs pay sometimes twice as much rent as rural MLAs. It's not always that split. There are different communities that have different rental prices, but we're at the exigencies of the rental market in that way. And that directly impacts our ability to use our budget for our constituents. Similarly, there are some small constituencies that may have, with the new ridings, triple the number of electors as some other geographically small constituencies, depending on where those constituencies are located. So when it comes to things like a mailing or producing literature, that number matters. And so what we're asking for is a review of that. That could be undertaken by the Speaker's Administration Office. If they want to farm that out to someone, that's also fine. So I'll leave it at that and happy for discussion.
Okay, thank you. Questions or comments? Ms. McFarland first, then Minister McClellan.
Thank you very much. And I want to thank my colleague for those comments. I think that I totally understand the underlining narrative of wanting to ensure that everyone is representing their constituents fairly. And I think that perhaps a review will be necessary. I don't believe it should happen now, for the main reason that with the addition of 4 other constituencies, I think it would only be fair that once those constituencies have their representatives and have their MLA elected, that those MLAs are able to speak on behalf of the constituencies, these new constituencies that they're going to represent. I think that it is it would be a very complex review, and I would hope that who would ever be leading this review would be able to reach out to every MLA and hear the issues that we're all facing. I think that, it's a small province, but we know regionally we all have different issues and how we represent our constituencies. There's a number of things that we think about that we all need. And I would just want a more transparent and wholesome conversation and review to happen equally once, perhaps after an election, which we know is just right around the corner. So I want to be clear that I'm not against a review at all at this time. And I'm new to this this committee, and I wasn't aware that this was something that my colleague has been bringing up for the last 2 years. It's unfortunate that perhaps a motion wasn't made 2 years ago, but I do believe because of the new boundaries that we really should hold off until after the next election. There's a lot of concerns, and I think about next Wednesday. It's like we can't find someone to drive a couple people to go get a vaccine that they have to get in Antigonish. And right now I'm waiting for the Minister of Health to give approval that I can drive them because I'm supposed to remain in my bubble because they have no transportation. There's all kinds of things. Some MLAs, we fill up people's oil tanks and never get reimbursed again. There's all kinds of issues that need to be discussed. And I think, again, it's only fair that we wait until after an election and make sure that all MLAs are able to be part of that review. So with those words, I really think we need to wait after the next election. Thank you.
Minister McClellan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And just probably it's a good segue for me. And I think for you, Mr. Speaker, maybe Deb, there might be some added comments and context around the timeline piece. So I'll skip that for now. The segue from Carla's points, even for my own members, quite frankly, Alan and Claudia and I talk about a lot of things, and you, Kevin, of course, Mr. Speaker, and it's kind of part of the ebb and flow of the Speaker and House leaders' discussions. And without a doubt, this has been something that Claudia has flagged easily for a couple of years. And I think it becomes about the disparity between the rents and how it impacts budgets vis-a-vis rural, urban. And obviously, it affects some caucuses more than others, but we would all like it to affect our caucus the most by way of members. So it's certainly a conversation that I support with regard to a review. Again, the timing, I think I'll put it back to Kevin and Deb, the Speaker's office, for some clarification on that. But two of the stipulations that I've always had was, number one, whatever we do here, it's not to the detriment of those who have minuscule rents. And I think there's the NDP wouldn't have any of those because they're not wouldn't be subject to the rural market as much as the rest of us. But certainly there's lots of cases where rents are incredibly small. But in terms of that, I'm mindful, and also for me as the government house leader, it's what the impact is for the Treasury Board. So I just want to make sure that whatever language and sort of the terms of reference we use around that review, that it's mindful of what the overall cost increase may or may not be. Obviously, there's a significant amount in each budget, and whether some of it goes back and some of it doesn't, in terms of the general coffers at the end of each budgetary year. So I'm certainly happy to support the review. I don't think it's something that is unreasonable as it relates to the public. But again, I think the timing, as Carla referenced, and Kevin, you may have something to add about that. We've really got to get that right. And I support Claudia's haste, but I don't know if it can be ready for the next one or not. So I'll turn that back to you. Thanks.
Any other questions or comments before I float a couple? Ms. Gender?
Well, I'll reserve the right to respond again, but just to those points, I appreciate the points of my colleagues, and just to respond a little bit, I would say to the issue of the impact on Treasury Board, and I think that's an interesting conversation. We know that a great deal of money gets returned not just from the House of Assembly, but from the MLA office budget line each year to the Treasury. And without a doubt, although we can't budget with money that's in the budget, as it were, that amount is probably more than the impact of any change that we have discussed or contemplated would be. So I'm confident that we can find a solution that doesn't put additional impact on the Treasury Board. In terms of Ms. McFarland's point, which I appreciate, I think there's two different things. Maybe I think what I'm suggesting is not a complete overhaul of the MLA expense system. I think that's been done. But more, and to be quite frank, and I mean, maybe this conversation will go in a different way, and maybe this would have the result. You know, this felt very much more like a number crunching exercise than it did like a consultation exercise. And I think given that we have, number one, MLAs can no longer enrich themselves with their budget in any way. We don't have that opportunity. As you say, Ms. McFarland, you know, the big-hearted among us, and I'm sure you're one of the biggest, will go out and spend their money on people and things and not be reimbursed. And that's that's your own prerogative. But in terms of what we're expensing, you know, we are expensing things. They don't belong to us. They belong to the government. We're not going to keep them. That's not an issue. And so I'm just saying right now we have a sort of mathematical equation that only takes into account the size of your constituency. And so what I'm just suggesting is that we make it that equation changes, and that it also takes into account potentially the number of electors, but also some way of, as the House Leader said, not impacting people who are fortunate enough to have a small amount of rent, but not penalizing people who are maybe paying triple that. So, for instance, you know, one possible suggestion in that along that range was, what if there's $1,000 line item for everybody for office rent? And if you pay less than that, if you pay $700, great. You have an extra $300 in your budget. But everybody else gets the same amount deducted, just like our CAs aren't in our budget, right? Like we don't pay our CA salary out of our budget. It gets paid separately. So we're not differentially impacted by that cost. And so what I'm saying is we are differentially impacted by the cost of rent. And I'm suggesting that needs to change. So, you know, and to the comments on timing, with respect, you know, the timing is never right. And I see this commission as, you know, needing to do what it says, which is to take care of the House of Assembly. And with, you know, and I think with those new constituencies coming online, and with the fact that we are going to face an election soon, that the idea that we could start with a new system, or at least with contemplating a new system, it'll be a new group of people, most likely, you know, looking at this suggestion, is a good thing. You know, then we have the opportunity to start on a new foot that's more equitable.
Okay, thanks. I see Ms. McFarland has her hand up. I'd just like to weigh in if I could here, and then I'll come to you, Ms. McFarland. So thanks very much, Ms. Chender, for putting the motion forth. I think as we've had in our conversations that Minister McClellan has referenced, it certainly is an admirable goal to have every MLA, whether it's 51 or the incoming 55, to have an equal footing in terms of budget and operating expenses to work with. I don't think any of us here would argue that point in terms of its fairness and the having that as a goal. The question is, I guess, is how do we get there in a fair and equitable fashion that takes into account all of the variables that make it a pretty complicated process. So I can appreciate, you know, it on the surface, it may seem like number crunching, and certainly that's a huge part of it. But when you start to look beyond the numbers and see, you know, that the kind of the domino effect or the push and pull on one thing versus another, urban versus rural, with towns in between, population, which certainly, you know, the Electoral Boundaries Commission just completed, as we all know, a pretty rigorous exercise to mandate that we go from 51 to 55 constituencies, and it's largely based on, you know, population equity, which the push and pull on that is some constituencies, particularly in the urban areas, are quite small, but very densely populated versus some of our rural constituencies that have much less population density. So your tool for reaching your constituents, and I only say this for purposes of making the example, becomes not a vehicle to get from one end of the constituency to another, but a good pair of sneakers to get from one side to another. So there certainly is a lot of rationale behind those figures to give consideration to. And the other point that I want to stress is that we can make whatever motion we want here today, but I want to make sure as chair of this committee that it's doable and it's achievable. So I think and Ms. Lesby can comment, but we're coming into a busy period for the Speaker's administration staff relative to executing not only their normal work, but the effects of the changes that we just made to the handful of regulations that we just did. So they'll be getting ready for that, as well as coming into the reality of the summer staff vacation season. So I'll let Ms. Lesby comment should she want to in terms of the achievability of doing something in that short of a turnaround time that comes back to us with some meaningful and relevant information, as opposed to either some other timeline, but also perhaps some other mechanism for actually doing the review. And as you point out, stopping short of kind of a full-on review of everything related to MLA offices. But even if we were to single out a couple of items, as I think is what you're getting at, but is there a better avenue for us to get that done that perhaps takes into consideration, because we've certainly had conversations, but maybe there's 55 more opinions or 54 more opinions that may need to be considered in terms of what makes it difficult to operate as an MLA in any given constituency. So those would be my comments. So Ms. McFarland, go ahead.
Thank you so much, Mr. Speaker. And I just want to reaffirm to the member from Dartmouth South that it's absolutely not that I'm against a review, but if we look at your comments just the last time you spoke there, it seems like the issue is really about rent, but your motion doesn't really reflect that. It actually opens up your motion, I would say, opens up a whole can of worms, for lack of better words, really. And I think that that's what has to happen. A review that is actually going to enable a lot of conversations to happen around all kinds of issues with MLAs and what they're using their budgets for and what they find, rather difficult or not. So talking to a few MLAs, some are completely fine with their budgets, others aren't. So I think it's a larger discussion. And I think, to be fair in giving it certainly the time it would require to do a very transparent and productive review and have the outcome that would be beneficial at the end of the day to our constituents is sincerely going to only be able to happen after an election where we have a fair opportunity for all MLAs to speak. So once again, I just want to reaffirm that it's not that I'm against it. I think timing is absolutely crucial, and I think this is the wrong timing for us to set aside funds or time for a review on something that affects us and ultimately affects our constituents. But I just think there's other priorities right now. And again, my vote and my issue would be to please delay it and let's do it right. So again, thank you for allowing me to speak.
One more comment, Ms. Chender, would it be acceptable, and I'm just thinking out loud here on the spot, nobody get nervous, but would it be acceptable to because again, I sense that there's no disagreement with kind of the end goal here to take a look at this and make sure that we're doing things in the most fair and equitable way. But would it be acceptable, given that there is a few parameters there and perhaps a couple of options in order to achieve this, that instead of asking staff to do the full review by the next meeting, would you be agreeable to ask staff to come back to us at our next meeting with to put some time and effort into exploring the options for how we could do a review, and then we deal with that at the next meeting?
Are you calling on me, Mr. Speaker? So yes, I think that's fine. And I just want to say that, we have spent the last several House of Assembly Management Commission meetings making a package of changes to the House of Assembly Management Act that achieve lots of changes similar to the ones that I'm suggesting. And so all the points around timing and this isn't the right time and when are we going to, are well taken, but also, frustrating because, some changes that folks, want to achieve happen and some changes get kicked down the road. All that being said, Mr. Speaker, I think that your suggestion makes a lot of sense and I am open to that.
Okay, any questions or comments on that? So again, we're I guess a bit more focused on asking staff to put a little bit of thought into this to see how we can achieve some kind of manageable review in a timely fashion of MLA operating budgets. So Minister Porter and then Ms. DiCostanzo.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I won't get into this too far. Appreciate all the conversation, opinions. So just based on what you've said, are we just looking for an amendment to Ms. Chender's motion to table today and for future reference, or that's the only clarity I'm looking for? I guess I'm fine.
Does everybody have Ms. Chender's motion in front of them? So maybe we'll just park your question, Minister Porter, for a second, and we'll go to Ms. DiCostanzo and then over to Ms. Chender. Ms. DiCostanzo.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. You said to ask the clerks to investigate or to do some research. Should it not include some kind of a survey or a questionnaire that's sent to all the MLAs? So just to get some opinions of where this issue to most of them. I mean, that's where, if some MLAs are having issues and they would prefer to have similar way of charging the rent as a separate item as CA, and maybe as Ms. Chender said, 1,000 is an average, or there is a scale of this is minimum and that's maximum, and then but the actual looking after it is taken out of the budget, and it's from a separate budget similar to the CA. I think that was a wonderful idea to think to bring forward, but just it may not be everybody's. I know in the city we pay a lot more for rent compared to others, so it will help us in the city, but it may not help the others. That's all. Thank you.
Ms. Chender.
I am open. I don't know if you're asking me to propose new language, Mr. Speaker, or maybe it makes more sense for you to do that so that we know that it works for your staff.
Okay. Thank you, Ms. DiCostanzo, for the comments. I think just noting for the record on the question of the rent, there has been a bit of work done on that, a fair bit actually, in terms of bringing together and analyzing the data. And it's the old saying goes, the numbers don't lie. So it's an interesting exercise to look at the collection of 51 rents to see kind of the minimum and the maximum and the average per square foot and the groupings of urban versus rural versus towns seem to be another category. So, it does kind of feed into the narrative that there is no easy solution to that one. Not to say that there isn't a solution, but it's not an obvious one. So I'm just going to go back to Ms. Chender's motion as she proposed. And perhaps if everybody has it in front of them now, that the House of Assembly Management Commission review MLA office budget allocations to ensure equitable access to resources required for MLAs to serve their constituents, and that the result and an accompanying recommendation to improve expense equity be reported to the Commission at its next meeting. So perhaps if we were to alter that motion or amend it to read something like this, and we're open to suggestions or wordsmithing here, that the House of Assembly Management Commission ask staff to review MLA office budget allocations to ensure, I've already lost my train of thought.
Kevin, do you want to add in there and expenses?
Do we?
Well, that's what I think I can quickly put together a chart of everybody showing, what their rents are. We already have that. The postage was mentioned. Also, they're right down here. Travel, constituency travel, types of items.
Okay, I've got a couple of speakers here. So Minister Porter, then Ms. McFarland.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I guess I would say this, in my opinion, the motion is fine with the exception of the very last few words where it references next meeting. Just a future meeting is all that's required. And then we're able to move forward and look at the options and take the time that's necessary to do so. That seems to be the issue with the motion to begin with, is the timing. So perhaps if there's time, it can come before the next election. Who knows when that will be, although some think, well, the sounds of it, it's soon. However, a lot of work, and I guess maybe I've been around too long, but a lot of work has gone into expenses, and some might forget a few years back, but a great deal of work around all of that has been done by the Speaker's office and staff. And we have been in what I would argue is a pretty good place over recent years. Things seem to be, unless Deborah can speak to this more clearly, but things seem to be running fairly well. I look at the year ends. We all know where we fit in that long list of what we spend, what we don't spend. Yes, we all have a variety of different expenditures, rent, advertising, et cetera. But that procedure is around the allowables, what you can do, what you shouldn't, can't do, et cetera. It's very clear. I like it. It's been spelled out very clearly, quite frankly. This I have no opposition to whatsoever, with the exception of I don't want to press staff or anyone else for a time. That means next meeting, unless you're going to book that 3 months from now, which I doubt. So I'm happy to support the motion, provided we make that one change. That's all I'm looking for. But anyway, I'd hate to see it be lost after all of the discussion today because we can't come to some right wording. Thanks.
Okay, that's a good suggestion, Minister Porter. Ms. McFarland.
Thanks so much, Mr. Speaker. Okay, so maybe I wasn't articulating my concern here. I don't think the review should go at all until we have our 4 new MLAs in place after the next election. I think it's only fair that we have them be able to speak on this. Maybe someone's paying $2,000 for rent in Halifax, and I'm only paying $1,000. But maybe their $2,000 includes their internet, their heat, their lights. Mine doesn't. So no, but I mean, this is why it has to be an in-depth review. And I believe the only fair way and transparent way we can move forward without having backlash later on from the MLAs, that the new 4 MLAs that will be elected, as well as the MLAs that are currently, I can take my colleague, for example, from Queens, Shelburne right now, who's losing Shelburne and is going from 14,000 people down to 7,000 or 8,000 people to represent. Is she going to want to lose her budget, even though she's losing half of her constituency? We cannot proceed in this on good conscience. I can't. I cannot proceed. What I can do is I could make a motion right now that the member from Dartmouth South's motion is tabled to be further discussed after an election, while in good conversation and informally suggesting that Ms. Lusby take it upon her staff when time permits for them. And it's again, not a real priority, in my opinion, given what we're going through right now, to discuss how would a review look like? What would it look like? How much would it possibly cost? To come back with some information for us as members of this committee. I just don't see the point of trying to come up with new words for a new motion. I think that there's a lot yet to be discussed. Again, as the motion sits, it's not just about rent control. It's about the whole budget allotment that's given. And again, that cannot be fairly discussed without all 55 MLAs. So I can't emphasize that any more than what I'm doing, but I will be voting. I can't vote in good conscience.
Okay. Once I see your hand, Ms. Gender, there. One thought that I've had is perhaps this might be a topic to task the MLA remuneration panel, review panel, with if it is the wishes of the commission and the House to add that scope to their review, which would occur immediately following the election. That is something that perhaps would allow an independent body to, with some parameters set by this commission, to undertake and then report back. Ms. Gender.
Well, I mean, if that is amenable to members, then I'm fine to go that way, Mr. Speaker. Otherwise, I'm also to Minister Porter's point. I think the current motion could just be amended to say in that last sentence, and progress to be reported to the commission at its next meeting, which would then just sort of commit to that being undertaken at some point, and to the Speaker's office, just letting us know what's happening. So either of those are amenable to me, depending on, the wishes of the other members. And I will say, I think there's lots of things going on right now. We're in the middle of a third wave, but our job is to help our constituents through that. And the front line of that is our offices. And so, with respect to my colleagues, this doesn't feel like just a housekeeping issue to me. And it doesn't feel like that to my colleagues either. And I would agree with Minister Porter that things have been running pretty smoothly. We really rely on the Speaker's Administration Office, and we think they do a great job. And we're able to process our expenses and represent our constituents. And so there's no issue with any of that. That is not the issue we're raising. And I think it is clear in my motion that the issue we're raising is just the equity of the budget allocation. That's it. It's not about process. It's not about any of that. And just, in 2021, what does that budget allocation need to take into effect? Not the process by which it's, paid out or anything like that. So, back over, I know the House Leader maybe has his hand up, or to you, Mr. Speaker, on, what's most amenable to you in terms of an amendment.
Okay, I missed Mr. McMaster.
A fellow said to me one time, "We're all equal until we're unequal." This is a difficult thing to define, even because all of our constituencies are so different. Mine is about close to 70% the size of Prince Edward Island geographically, but yet I've also got a population that is larger than, with the changes coming up for the next election, that'll be larger than many of the metro constituencies. My rent in Inverness, because Inverness is a couple of world-class golf courses, suddenly real estate has become expensive in Inverness. And my rent per square foot is quite high, higher than a lot of the metro MLAs. Yet I'm not spending all my budget. My constituency, because of its size, has a tremendous number of issues that you would never hear spoken of in Halifax. I could say that it's kind of unfair that I've got a lot of workload because of the nature of my constituency compared to, say, a metro constituency or maybe even just a smaller rural constituency. Because we've got every issue under the sun here in Inverness, and it certainly makes it interesting. But this is a hard one to define because the motion is sort of based on rent, but it's also, if more money is allocated in budgets, what is that money going to be spent on? And I know in the past, a little over 10 years ago, just when I was coming in, some MLAs were spending money on things that they were found they shouldn't have been spending it on. And I guess some of our expenses are fixed. I think of an office. It's debatable whether it's more expensive in the city or in the rural areas. I think based on the analysis the Speaker's office has put together, some of our expenses are fixed. We all probably go through maybe a similar amount of paper. We all need a computer. Beyond that, we start getting into the world of creative and, advertising. I've got 3 radio stations. I've got an Acadian radio station in Shetticamp. I have the Hawk in Port Hawkesbury. But I also have this radio station in Antigonish because a lot of people, north of even Port Hood, north are listening to CJFX in Antigonish. So I have 3 radio stations that I need to have a presence on. If I was in the city, I might not have any, or I might have one, I suppose. I guess depending on the listeners you want to advertise to, I suppose you could have more than one in the city as well. But all of this to say, this is a very difficult exercise, and especially to ask the Speaker's office staff to find out what's equitable, because there's so many variables to this. And at the end of the day, if we're getting extra money in our budgets, the question becomes, what are we going to spend it on? And if it's sort of creative advertising to help community groups, it's certainly admirable, but is it advertising at that point, or is it us wanting more taxpayer dollars to try to promote ourselves? And I suppose that is, part of the purpose of advertising. But I think at its core purpose, our purpose to advertise as MLAs is to make sure people know how to contact our office or know where we are, know what we do. We certainly have lots of ways to promote ourselves through press releases and whatnot to the public beyond that. But I guess that's the challenge for me with this motion is I don't know where it's going. And it's very difficult to try to make everybody equal. And I fear that this exercise is not really, it might, but I think it's a lot to put on the Speaker's office, and maybe there needs to be, I think Ms. DeCostanza said, a survey of MLAs. Maybe MLAs should have a chance to offer input on what they think is unfair or unequal. Perhaps the Speaker's office could, as a starting point, collect that information, and maybe we could have another discussion on it. But it's difficult for me to support the motion today because I don't know where it's going.
Okay. Minister McClellan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and good discussion. I think for me, again, I do see the rationale for it, and given what we've discussed here on the timing, I think that's what's in my own, again, perspective, and not even speaking for Rafa and Chuck on this one, and you for that matter, Kevin, but. I would probably, I think that the first line is fine. And I think after the comma, it would basically to reflect, again, in my view, something around that we would ask the Speaker's office to go back and look at the options for how we would conduct a review and what that timeline could possibly look like. So for the next meeting, and my assumption is that there would be one soon because there is some additional housekeeping issues that at that point we could discuss about how exactly we would do that. And maybe there are some options there. So for me, that's what the new motion would look like if we were going to advance one, respecting all three sides of this in terms of opinion and whether or not they would support it. Zach and I were the first members, literally, and the ink wasn't dry on the changes after the expense scandal. So the regime that we were part of in 2010 was much different than the one, obviously, that was before us. And I'm not pandering to Deborah and her team and the Speaker's office, but they had a lot of cleaning up to do. And I think the system that we got used to was much tighter than our predecessors. And I think that, if we were to engage Deb and the group again, to look at least those options for providing a review, whether that's third party or done with in-house, or again, as Rafa referenced and Alan talked about the sort of interview or engagement with the MLAs, that's all fine. And look, maybe I've said this from the beginning, maybe at the end of this journey in terms of the trying to understand what the impact is for rents, and as you mushroom out to the other issues, maybe it'll determine that status quo is the best option we can use. So it's not necessarily that things are all going to change, although I would probably assume with this one, given the disparity around rent, that something will change. But in any event, I think, it's been good discussion, and not claiming that we should wrap it up now. But I think if we've got enough, Kevin and Mr. Speaker, I don't know where that puts us in terms of a motion to amend it, or what further discussion we need to put a bow on this one for today. So, but that's my thought on it.
Okay. So, Ms. Chandler, do you want to put some words around a new motion?
Sure, I'll take a crack at it. So the motion would be that the House of Assembly Management Commission review MLA office budget allocations to ensure equitable access to resources required for MLA to serve their constituents. And that the result, that progress be reported to the commission at its next meeting.
Okay. Any comments on that, or do the members want to see that in writing? Ms. McFarland? Oh, you're on mute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So basically, we're saying that nothing has changed in the motion, if we're still expecting, by the next meeting. I guess the expectations for Ms. Lesby's office and everything, I mean, are we just going to, they may not be able to present anything to us within the next month, given their workload. That's all. I don't know if it can even start really, again, without having these other MLAs to be taking part. I just don't know why we're putting so much priority on this today. I really don't. It seems kind of, I just don't understand why we're focused so much on this when we know better, and we know that it's only going to be fair when the other MLAs are in place. I don't know why we can't put a motion, or I can put a motion forward that, we table this motion until after the next election, when there will be fairness for all MLAs to speak their mind. Or perhaps maybe it's, a review can start but cannot be complete until after a next election, so that all MLAs will have their say.
Okay.
So, Mr. Speaker, I just would like that motion to be on the floor. It's not saying that anything needs to be completed before the election, and progress might mean minimal progress, but it just gets the ball rolling. So if we could vote on that, unless people need to see it on writing.
Okay, so just for purposes of clarity, can you just read that again, Ms. Gender?
Yeah, let's see if I can get it the same twice. The motion is that the House of Assembly Management Commission review MLA office budget allocations to ensure equitable access to resources required for MLAs to serve their constituents, and that progress be reported to the commission at its next meeting.
Okay. Any further comments or questions on that motion as presented? Mr. Charlton?
I apologize. I was just trying to find my unmute button there. I was just wondering if something a little closer to what was being discussed by the committee or the members of the commission here might be for the House of Assembly Management Commission to direct staff to consider how best to conduct a review of MLA expenses and to report back at the next meeting. So that would be the initial step. Subject to whatever Deborah might say here, but I'm getting a thumbs up, so it's a good sign. So the initial step would be her office considers how best to conduct a review, report back next meeting, and then the commission can take steps to go forward with that, because there are a number of options, whether it's an internal review by Deborah's office, whether it's hiring a third party, whether it's wrapping it up with the MLA remuneration review panel. Deb can look at these various options and try to suggest what's the best way forward is.
That's totally fine with me. I think you said MLA expenses. It's budgets that we're talking about.
Sorry, the budgets, yes.
And then that's fine for me.
Yeah. So the motion would then be that the House of Assembly Management Commission direct staff to review to consider the best way to conduct a review of MLA office budget allocations, and report back at the next meeting of this commission.
Okay, I'm getting the sense that that's an acceptable way to go. That covers off all the bases and considers everybody's concerns. So if that's the motion and there's no further comment or question, could I have, obviously Ms. Gender is going to put that forth, I assume?
So moved.
Moved by Ms. Gender, seconded by Minister McClellan. Would all those in favor of the motion please indicate aye? Contrary minded, nay? So I have four, the number 4 in favor and 3 against. So the motion is carried. Now, just for clarity, and I may be confused, but Ms. McFarland, did you have a motion? No, okay. All right. Thank you very much. A great discussion. That concludes the business for today for the House of Assembly Management Commission. Thank you, everybody. The meeting is adjourned.